We're here with Tatiana Androsov. And hello, Tatiana. How are you?
I am great.
Good deal. Uh, I understand that you are recently wrote a second book. I know you wrote your first book, Choices, which is already available in Amazon. Tell us a little bit about your second book, which is called Mangoes and Blood. And why mangoes and blood?
Well, because if you're going to laugh, it starts with mangoes and it ends with blood. That is as simple as that. It also takes one back to Africa, where it does take place. And that is very important because mangoes grow in Africa and they're wonderful in Africa and they're terribly juicy in Africa. And the story, though it's very short, is juicy.
And it is also available in Amazon, is that correct?
Absolutely. It's available on Amazon. It's actually a novella. The first one that I published is a novel. This is a novella.
And what is the setting of the book? Where is it taking place?
It's taking place in a city in East Africa, not that far from the sea. And I have to tell you how I thought about it. When I was in Africa, in a certain city in the 1970s, I walked into a hotel, an almost brand new hotel, went up to a room where we're going to have a reception for high-ranking people, for people as high as ministers, what we would call Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of Trade, and obviously people from the international community because this was an international meeting. And I stood in that room and I could not believe it. It did not have an entry point and an exit point. It just had one double door. So there was no emergency exit. There were no windows. And it is that which gave me the idea for the whole story. Because the 1970s, for those of you who don't know, was a time when hostage-taking was, let us say, in horrible terms, in fashion. Hostages were taken right and left.
Now, the reason you were in Africa in the first place was for what reason?
I was there for a UN conference. I was always there for UN conferences. I used to work for the United Nations. And during that period in my life, I was a simultaneous interpreter with the United Nations.
Understand. Now, Tatiana, you're also involved in human rights and helping people. Does this in some way tie in with the book?
Yes, very much so, because it ties in with everything I did subsequently. I also was, for instance, the chief of voter education for the very famous Mandela elections in South Africa, chief of voter education for the United Nations mission, which was watching over the elections. And so, therefore, obviously, I'm interested in human rights because I want all human beings to have the same right to choose. That's what I call voting, is choosing for what you want. And in this case, in this novella, I deal with hostage takers who feel that they do not have the right to choose.
Tell us a little bit about other countries that you've been in.
I've been in dozens of countries in Africa. I've been in Algeria, I've been in Tunisia, I've been in Egypt, I have been in Cameroon, I have been in Senegal, I have been in Mozambique, I have been in Tanzania, I have been in Kenya. So I've covered the north, the east, the west, the south of Africa.
You should have your own transportation system by now, right?
Oh, actually, I have a giant real report which deals with the transportation systems north and south of Africa, in all of the continent of Africa.
Now, as far as the hero of the book, and can you tell us a little bit more about the actual the people involved in the book?
Well, you have the hostage takers. You also have the people who are taken hostages. You have a young woman who is Austrian. In this book, the young woman is Austrian and who has obviously never been a hostage. And then you have two male heroes who are both from countries that used to be colonies of European powers. And they fought for their freedom. So you can consider them freedom fighters, or you can consider them, well, as bad as hostage takers. You can consider them terrorists, because in order to acquire freedom for their countries, which they thought was necessary, they committed acts which we would call terrorist acts. And in this particular novella, they are now representatives of their government. One, a very high-level representative, a minister from his government, and the other one who works for him. So you have an older person and a person who actually studied in Europe, in the same country that was his colonial power in the 1960s, which were a very turbulent but interesting time for students when everybody fought for the rights of students, when people fought for the right to study things that were slightly different from what had been offered for decades and decades.
But Tatiana, I understand you also worked for the UN since college. And tell us a little bit about your background in terms of education, where you went to school.
I went to some very famous American schools. I went to Mount Holyoke College, which is the oldest college for women in the world. It was founded in 1837, and it is one of the Seven Sisters. Before the Ivy League opened its doors, Mount Holyoke, as one of the Seven Sisters, produced the elite women that mostly married with the Ivy League graduates. So this was a very, very interesting social system in the United States that really no longer exists anymore, because the Ivy League opened its doors to women, and most of the Ivy League schools the Seven Sisters, chose to become coeducational, just as did the Ivy League. But Mount Holyoke chose to remain a women's college.
Tell us more about the actual book and the possibility of it becoming a movie, perhaps?
Since it is set in one room, and it begins and ends in that one room, essentially, for the 90%, of course, you always have flashbacks, but these days that can be done differently. It is something that is short. It is something that has a beginning and an end. It is something that comprises in, let us say, the period of about 12 hours, because that's about the period of time that the book takes place in, a whole drama, because you have people who have known each other before, but they suddenly are together in a different setting, in a horrible setting, because they're hostages. They don't know who their hostage takers are. They don't know what is going to happen. These are people who are not used to being under the threat of death. And you always have to consider that when you are a hostage.
Also very interesting that you had the manuscript for this book for some time before it was published.
I had it since the 1970s. I actually wrote it in 1979. I discovered that because I had the address of my apartment in Geneva, Switzerland, as part of the manuscript. And I didn't do anything with it, because if you write something about an organization or a system of organizations, you can be sure that that system will not allow you to continue working with them. That is normal, because nobody wants to know how the inside works. And normally that's what you do as a novelist. You show how individuals, human beings, work together in an organization.